A king beaten to death inside the Tower of London, his body dragged out to prove he was really dead. His skull later found cracked from blunt force, proof of execution, not mercy. The murder of Henry VI in 1471 wasn't just another royal killing, it was the execution of an entire age, the moment medieval kingship itself was murdered. After Henry's death, crowns stopped being sacred. Power stopped being divine. What came next was colder, calculated, and modern. Hollywood sells you a Middle Ages of noble knights and sacred bloodlines, but this story, this murder, is what the Middle Ages really looked like when they died. A king slaughtered in his cell, his body paraded to erase his legitimacy, his killers rewarded for ending an era. By the end of this video, you'll see why Henry VI's death didn't just end a dynasty, it ended the medieval world. Stand in 1422 and watch a 9-month-old baby crowned King of England and France. You'd see Henry VI's reign begin with an impossibility, an infant ruling 2 kingdoms through regents who'd spend decades fighting over power, while the boy grew up sheltered from reality. Henry wasn't groomed for kingship properly because nobody expected him to actually rule both kingdoms. His father, Henry V, had died suddenly, leaving an impossible legacy. You'd watch young Henry grow into adolescence surrounded by ambitious nobles using him as a puppet, never developing the ruthlessness monarchy required. By his 20s, you'd see the signs everyone ignored. Henry was deeply religious, not politically religious, genuinely pious in ways that made him unsuitable for medieval kingship. He'd flinch from violence, struggle with decisive action, prefer prayer to politics. In a monk, these were virtues. In a king, they were catastrophic weaknesses. His first mental breakdown came in 1453. You'd watch the King of England become catatonic, completely unresponsive for over a year. Unable to speak, unable to recognize people, unable to rule. His newborn son was presented to him, and Henry showed no recognition. The realm was ruled by regents while its king stared at nothing, trapped in his own mind. When he recovered, the damage was done. You'd see nobles who'd tasted power, unwilling to relinquish it. Richard of York, who'd served as protector during Henry's madness, now had supporters who believed he'd make a better king. The seeds of civil war, the Wars of the Roses, were planted in Henry's mental collapse. Henry represented everything medieval kingship theoretically valued: piety, mercy, peace-seeking. But you'd watch him lose everything because medieval reality valued something else: strength, ruthlessness, the ability to hold power through force. He was a walking contradiction, a good man who was a terrible king, proof that virtue didn't equal fitness to rule. Henry VI was medieval kingship's ideal king in theory and complete failure in practice, and his existence exposed the system's fundamental contradictions. Stand in 1455 and watch English nobles do something unprecedented: choose sides in a civil war where both claimants had legitimate arguments for the throne. You'd see the sacred nature of kingship dissolving into pragmatic power struggle. The Yorkist claim was strong. Richard of York descended from Edward III through both parents, arguably a better bloodline than Henry's Lancastrian descent. But Henry was the anointed king. Medieval political theory said God chose kings. Challenging an anointed monarch was challenging God. You'd watch that theory shatter against political reality. The wars weren't constant fighting. You'd see years of uneasy peace punctuated by brutal battles where nobles literally killed each other for control of a king who couldn't effectively rule. Henry was captured, lost, recaptured, lost again, treated as a prize to be held rather than monarch to be obeyed. Watch the Battle of Towton in 1461, possibly the bloodiest battle on English soil. You'd see 28,000 men dead in a single day of fighting in a snowstorm. The savagery was unprecedented. Nobles executed after battles, breaking the ransom tradition. Common soldiers were slaughtered rather than allowed to flee. The old rules of warfare were dying along with the men. Edward IV, Richard of York's son, won decisively and had himself crowned. But Henry was still alive, still the anointed king to his supporters. You'd watch Edward face a problem no medieval king had quite faced. How do you legitimize your rule when the previous king is still breathing? The old answer, God chose the winner, was wearing thin. The new answer was forming, kill the previous king and control the narrative. For a decade, Edward ruled while Henry lived in captivity. You'd see a bizarre dual kingship, Edward holding power, Henry holding legitimacy. The contradiction couldn't persist indefinitely. Medieval political philosophy said there could be only one true king. Reality now said the true king was whoever could hold power, and that required eliminating competitors permanently. The Wars of the Roses turned kingship from sacred office into transferable prize, and Henry VI became the obstacle that had to be removed for the new order to solidify. Stand in 1470 and watch something remarkable. Henry VI restored to his throne after years of imprisonment. You'd see him led from the Tower, confused and aged beyond his years, placed back on a throne he'd never competently occupied. The readeption, as it was called, was engineered by Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, Warwick the Kingmaker, who'd previously supported Edward IV but now switched sides. You'd watch Henry become puppet again, this time too damaged by imprisonment and recurring mental illness to even pretend to rule. He was a symbol, not a leader. You'd see Henry during this period and barely recognize the man who'd been crowned decades earlier. His hair had gone white. His mind wandered. He'd speak of religious visions and seem unaware of political realities swirling around him. The restoration was weekend at Bernie's medieval style, propping up a barely functional monarch because his name still carried legitimacy. The return lasted 6 months. Edward IV invaded from exile with Burgundian support. You'd watch the Lancastrian forces disintegrate at the Battle of Barnet, where Warwick died, then collapse completely at Tewkesbury, where Henry's son Edward was killed, either in battle or executed immediately after. Sources disagree. With Edward of Lancaster dead, Henry became irrelevant. You'd see him return to the Tower, now truly finished. His son was dead. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was captured. His supporters were dead or had switched sides. He was a broken old man with no heirs, no supporters, no purpose, just a name that carried dangerous legitimacy as long as he breathed. The calculation Edward IV faced was brutal and simple. Leave Henry alive and risk future rebellions using his name, or kill him and deal with the political and spiritual consequences. Medieval precedent said you didn't kill anointed kings. You deposed them, imprisoned them, let them die naturally. But Edward was operating under new rules now. Henry's brief restoration proved he was too damaged to rule, but too legitimate to safely imprison, making his murder inevitable. Stand in the Tower of London on the night of May the 21st, 1471. You'd hear footsteps approaching Henry VI's cell, then sounds of violence, then silence. By morning, the king would be dead, and England would announce he died of pure displeasure and melancholy. The official story was a transparent lie. You'd hear it repeated. Henry, upon learning of his son's death and his cause's collapse, simply died of grief. Natural causes, no violence, just a broken man whose heart gave out. Nobody believed it. Nobody was supposed to believe it. The lie was the point, giving everyone plausible deniability while making the truth obvious. Later examinations of Henry's skull would reveal blunt force trauma. You'd see evidence he was murdered, struck from behind, probably with a mace or hammer. The killing was efficient, professional, designed to look like natural death from a distance, but unmistakable as murder up close. Edward IV wanted Henry dead, but needed the death to be technically deniable. The body was displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral, face visible, wounds presumably hidden by clothing and positioning. You'd watch Londoners file past their former king's corpse. The display served two purposes: prove he was actually dead, preventing imposter claims, and demonstrate what happened to threats against Edward IV. The message was clear: legitimacy didn't protect you anymore. Power did. You'd hear the accusations immediately. Tudor chroniclers later claimed Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III, murdered Henry personally. Contemporary accounts were more circumspect but pointed to Edward IV's orders. The exact killer mattered less than the fact. An anointed king was murdered in custody, and nobody faced consequences. The spiritual implications should have been catastrophic. Medieval Christianity taught that kings were God's anointed, that raising hands against them was mortal sin. You'd expect divine retribution, public outrage, ecclesiastical condemnation. Instead, you'd see pragmatic acceptance. Edward IV ruled successfully for another 12 years. The murder worked, and in working it proved the old rules were dead. Henry's murder in the Tower was the moment when medieval political theology died, killed by the same pragmatism that killed the king. Stand in 1471 after Henry's death and watch England not descend into chaos. You'd see Edward IV consolidating power, the Wars of the Roses effectively ending, stability returning. The murder worked, and everyone learned the lesson. Killing kings was possible, practical, and politically survivable if you had the power to control the aftermath. The precedent was devastating. You'd watch English politics transform. Richard III would later be accused of murdering his nephews, the princes in the Tower, using the same playbook. Henry VII would execute potential claimants with barely a pretense of legal process. The Tudor dynasty would build its legitimacy on ruthless elimination of Yorkist claimants, including executing elderly women whose only crime was having royal blood. Henry VI's murder taught rulers that legitimacy was manufactured, not inherent. You'd see the rise of propaganda, of controlling narratives, of rewriting history to justify present power. The Tudors would demonize Richard III, sanctify Henry VII, and portray the whole messy period as divine providence leading to their righteous rule. The medieval concept of kingship didn't survive. You'd watch it transform into something more pragmatic and more brutal. Kings were no longer God's anointed servants, but powerful men who held thrones through force, cunning, and ruthless elimination of competitors. The mystical element remained as useful fiction, but nobody really believed it anymore. You'd see religion weaponized rather than reverenced. Henry VI would be portrayed as a martyr and saint by Lancastrian sympathizers, miracles reported at his tomb, a cult of veneration developing. Edward IV tolerated it because dead Saint Henry was less dangerous than living legitimate King Henry. The transformation of the murdered king into a holy martyr was the final irony, religion blessing the murder it should have condemned. The European impact was subtler but real. You'd watch other monarchies learning from England's example. Weak kings became vulnerable, strong kings became ruthless. The Wars of the Roses demonstrated that internal stability mattered more than theoretical legitimacy. Power trumped right, and murder was a tool of statecraft if deployed correctly. Henry's murder ended the medieval political order and began something new, pragmatic power politics where legitimacy was manufactured and kings were mortal. You'd argue that dating historical eras to single events is oversimplification. You'd be right, but stand in 1471 and watch what died with Henry VI. Not just a king, but an entire worldview about kingship, legitimacy, and the relationship between divine will and earthly power. Medieval political thought held that kings were chosen by God, anointed in sacred ceremonies that made them different from other men. You'd see that theory break against Henry's murder. If God chose Henry, why did he die in a tower cell? If God chose Edward, why did he need to murder his predecessor? The theology didn't survive the contradiction. Watch the regicide that bookends this period. Charles I executed in 1649. You'd see careful legal process, public trial, attempt to justify the killing through law and parliament. That's post-medieval thinking, trying to make murder legitimate through procedure. Henry VI got no trial, no justification, just quiet elimination and transparent lies. The murder was medieval, the successful aftermath was modern. The transformation of warfare visible in the Wars of the Roses marked medieval combat's end. You'd see the old chivalric codes, ransom rather than execution, respect for noble prisoners, dying alongside the massive casualties. Towton's 28,000 dead represented industrial-scale killing that valued victory over honor. That's not medieval warfare, that's modern. Economic factors mattered too. You'd watch the wars bankrupt the nobility, destroying the feudal power base that defined medieval politics. The strong monarchy that emerged afterward, Tudor absolutism, was built on nobles too weakened by civil war to resist. The balance of power that defined medieval governance shifted permanently towards centralized royal authority. You'd see social changes accelerating. The printing press arrived in England in 1476, 5 years after Henry's death. Information became harder to control. Propaganda became more sophisticated. The ability of monarchs to control narrative, crucial to justifying Henry's murder, would face new challenges. Medieval information monopoly was ending. The murder represented choice: follow the old rules and risk instability, or break them and build stability on pragmatism. England chose pragmatism. You'd watch that choice ripple through European politics for centuries. Machiavelli would theorize it. The Reformation would weaponize it. Modern statecraft would perfect it. Henry VI died in 1471, but medieval kingship died with him, killed by the same ruthless pragmatism that crushed his skull in a tower cell. Movies show medieval politics as honor-bound nobles following chivalric codes. Henry VI's murder reveals something darker, political evolution through violence where old rules died because they stopped being useful. Hollywood makes regicide dramatic, public, meaningful. Henry died quietly in a cell, his murder covered by transparent lie that everyone understood but nobody challenged. That's not dramatic, it's coldly efficient. It's modern political murder wearing medieval clothing. Films show the Wars of the Roses as romantic tragedy. Stand in 1471 and you'd see calculating nobles killing each other's children, destroying their own class's power base, teaching everyone that loyalty was liability and survival required ruthlessness. The romance was propaganda written by victors. Modern people think the medieval ended with Columbus or the printing press or some clear historical marker. But stand in the Tower of London in 1471 and you'd see it end with blunt force trauma to an old man's skull. That's the uncomfortable truth. Historical eras don't end with grand gestures. They end with calculated murders that work because the old rules have already stopped applying. Henry VI's murder ended the medieval era not because it was dramatic, but because it proved medieval political theology was dead, and nobody cared enough to revive it.